Once upon a time, there was a video game series called Zero Escape, a series that will be heavily spoiled in this review for the final installment, so I recommend playing 999 and Virtue's Last Reward before returning to this. Now in this series there was one cliff, and the player's fingers, placed on the cliff by the series writers, found themselves facing an ultimately detrimental direction. Let's say gravity was a concern. Then came the Reaper of Prophets. One by one, it dislodged the player's fingers, and falling seemed inevitable. Until a goddamn bluebird arrived to fight it off. Yeah! Okay, I'm sorry. That might make a little bit more sense if you know the history of the game. Zero Escape is a puzzle, visual novel, and general adventure game series from Spike Chunsoft that plays heavily from plot twists and a tense, dreary atmosphere. Zero Time Dilemma is the third game in this narrative-heavy series, and there was a point it seemed like it would never exist at all. Essentially, after a third game seemed impossible from financial struggles for the Zero Escape series in the Japanese market, a petition and movement called Operation Bluebird in the West convinced those making the decision to support the game being made to actually have it be made. Let's just say the cliffhanger from Virtue's Last Reward helped motivations for the fans in the movement. I'm sure there were some Japanese players that helped support Operation Bluebird too, but the fandom for Zero Escape seems primarily Western related, so let's just note that. Though ultimately, I would like to say this before I start. Thank you, everyone that participated in this effort. By the time the game was actually released, or even announced, I had come to accept the idea it was never going to happen. But now, I finished the game, and I can even wear my Zero Time Dilemma Collector's Watch proudly. So now, let's see if it's worth all the drama. Oh, goodness, I hope it was. Zero Time Dilemma tends to find itself in a class of its own when it comes to gameplay. For the longest time, series used visual novel style presentation with an occasional choice and escape room puzzle sections. Zero Time Dilemma moves to a more cinematic presentation style and jumps between perspectives more than ever before. From this, many do argue that it's not a visual novel anymore. You could actually sort of argue this before given the prominence of the puzzles, but either way, you still have a choice system in place from the previous games, and it doesn't change that much outside of the presentation style. Choices still propel you down different paths of the story, and anything beyond are next to non-existent in the structure. So ultimately, what does define a visual novel? Well, that's sort of a topic for another video. Hint hint, hopefully, if I get around to it. But the important part is that outside of the presentation stylization, the game really does retain the familiar structure and different elements established in the series' second game and first game, Virtue's Last Reward and 999 respectively. It's also important to note the addition of fragments. These are part of the decision tree, branching story, and establish a non-linear timeline during the middle section of the game. It's another layer to the story, set above the system already in place, and really does help make it feel more open-ended in your progress. This includes the segmented puzzle elements and familiar interface established in Virtue's Last Reward. It's refined and improved upon, but the puzzles don't really try to deviate too much from what was done before. In fact, I'd say the focus on refining over redefining let them design the puzzles even better than before. There are not a ton of them, and they are jam-packed into the middle of the game, but if you're here for the story, you can rest easy. There are still parts that can become roadblocks, but they're less frequent than the previous outings, and solutions are just easily a Google away. I'd also say they handle quite well. I played some of the game on PC, and some on Vita, and some on PlayStation TV, and every control system felt intuitive. Of course, there are parts where a mouse is more effective, and parts where a controller is more effective, but they did well at balancing the shortcomings in each to not draw back any of the systems. Outside of those puzzles, the real focus of the game is on its own self-proclaimed, quote, decision game and, quote, events. These are the choices for this outing. It's actually pretty impressive how varied they ended up making the context and stylization of making a choice play out. You have your basic X or Y choice, you have trick choices that play with the player's mind, you also have straight-up logic puzzles wrapped around an imminent threat. It's all quite compelling, and really made the decisions themselves feel like a challenge to overcome. There are definitely some mind games on display, and the game knows well how to give its best poker face. Not that this was a big challenge for the developers anyways, as choice systems are hard to break with their simplicity, but moving from choices to full-fledged mechanics does wonders for immersion. While gameplay will never be the main draw of this series, the effort put in designing the mechanics to be complementary and enhance the narrative's main draw help prop up everything in the game. Zero Time Dilemma starts with a group of people waking up behind bars in an undisclosed location. A group of 9 had been placed in isolation as part of a simulated living condition for Mars experiment. The experiment goes awry as a mysterious man disrupts it. He walks in dressed like a plague doctor before declaring that there will be a death game where only 3 of the group can survive. 9 people are forced to play this decision game that decides who lives and who dies. He calls himself Zero the Second, and the members are split among 3 teams, isolated from one another, and the game begins. The connections to previous games is evident, so avoid this. Well, avoid the entire review if you don't want to get spoiled. Pretty sure I said that already though, so 5, 4, 3, 2, you good? No, spoiler, no turning back. Huh, here we go. First of all, we have the ever-present risk of Radical 6. Somehow, Radical 6 gets out of this experiment and kills 3/4 of humanity, including a massive nuclear explosion that leaves the world uninhabitable. That starts here, and many characters return from previous games because of the need to stop it. This includes Junpei, Akane, Sigma, and Vi. The story is pretty isolated, but it also manages to be connected beyond itself through the connections between the characters and the connections to the long-term effects of this game. It's also structurally similar to the previous games. The plot is branching, and significant choices create significant deviations. We have the introduction of fragments too. The plot introduces the idea of amnesia-inducing drugs being applied to the characters in the game on a regular and cyclical basis, and waking up without those memories leaves the memories you experience scattered. You can enter most of the different fragments at any time, and the plot is much less linear as a result. Mind you, it does cause some issues with pacing. The game's signature escape room puzzles are almost entirely in this non-linear fragment section, and it's almost entirely in this middle section of the story. Between the congestion of puzzles here and the general need to hold back on plot revelations and other information somewhat because it is a non-linear section of the plot, this is easily the most dull part of the grind. Now, pacing aside, the story actually has a very personal feel despite having such large stakes. Setting-wise, the almost claustrophobic sense of isolation to the characters, even in that setting, makes each of them matter so much more to their story. The mix of character arcs and the world in peril driving the plot offers a nice balance to keep the story grounded and appropriately emotional. I'd say that the character arcs are pretty satisfying, though there certainly are some open-ended ends to them. The new characters are a bit hit or miss too. They're definitely not written like they want to be fan favorites. They serve a good purpose and enhance the story, but man, can they be annoying at times. I'm looking at you, Eric. Though, ultimately, the end result of this all is whether this lives up to the expected payoff for a series of this scope and this much build-up. I would say that it does. I'm not going to pretend it's the best thing in the world, but the loose ends are wrapped up well and the plot twists are strong like always. There are still some lingering questions between the characters and some more vague plot elements, but none are left hanging over the player's mind and at least are intended to be open-ended. I tried to talk about some in the gameplay section to try to define what the game really is, but the presentation style is overhauled from the more familiar visual novel one predominant in the first 2 Zero Escape entries to a more cinematic one. And how did that work out? Well, it's definitely different. The specific twist is more of a move to just cinematic style in general. There are no text boxes, there is no static portrait set up with the occasional animations, there is no manually instigated progress through the dialogue, though you can pause it. If there was a comparison, be more akin to Telltale game presentation. Everything's animated, everything's coordinated, everything is more cinematic. If you're aware of the game's history of having economic woes to the point it almost went the way of Half-Life 3, then you may be wondering why they moved to such a clearly more expensive presentation style. Well, let's just say there are definitely some cut corners here. It's not exactly high fidelity, which was a given since it also needs to run on the 3DS somehow. It also has a smaller amount of environment locations, and the animations can be stiff and sometimes reused. Expressions have a good amount of expressiveness to them, but they're not numerous. Different cinematic shots make it clear that they avoided actually animating a part by throwing the camera towards the ceiling or flashing a screen white on impact. Alright, we get it, the presentation is shit, we get it, Echo. I can hear you saying it now, but not really. You can feel the budget's effect, sure, it's practically palpable, but that doesn't mean it's bad. Stiff animations take a little getting used to, and earlier awkwardness might haunt you for a while, but once you step over that barrier of the cut corners, they don't really take that much away from the experience. I know some would disagree, but I think it's a good step up from 999 and Virtue's Last Reward. Speaking of the previous games, the music actually sounds quite familiar this outing. There are reused tracks, some new ones, and some remixes. Overall, there isn't much more to say. The series has never been all that memorable musically, bar a few extremely memorable songs. So the reuse and remixes feel like standard fare now. I will note it is nice how they tend to place the different tracks with the most appropriate group of people, so it is a nice touch. The voice acting started in Virtue's Last Reward is a welcome return as well. I played in the English dub, and it's the same good quality you'd expect after VLR's dub. Ultimately, I'd say the presentation was definitely acceptable by the end, which is really about as much as you can expect from a game in this sort of position. The Zero Escape series has always had a narrative focus to an extreme. If you're looking for a puzzle game, this probably won't be for you. The puzzles definitely complement the experience, but this isn't any Tetris or Dr. Mario. How enjoyable this game is in both moment-to-moment and general terms will be generally dependent on how the elements gravitate towards this narrative focus. They simply need to not take away from it. The narrative itself is classic Zero Escape with plot twist and all. If you played the previous two games, you'll like what you find here. It doesn't revolutionize itself, but it's more the same. It helps itself by building up a story that is, on its own, quite isolated from the previous games and even the world around it. Sure, there are many connections beyond through the characters and long-term consequences, but the plot itself constrains itself to telling its own story. I'd also say that the characters are handled quite well too. They typically do well to play off each other and show their emotions naturally through their character arcs, and the cinematics do well to actually let them do that. In fact, I'd say that the cinematic approach gives a feeling of liveliness that can make even slower sections more compelling to go through than ever before. Ultimately, the presentation does work effectively through the game. There are certainly a few moments where it just does not match the emotions or feels completely botched entirely, but those are few and far between. In general, I say the stiffness of the animations is the greatest concern from the presentation. That is something I got used to pretty early on. Then you also have the puzzles. Like noted, they are complementary. They are pretty concentrated towards the middle of the game, and sometimes they can really feel like they are an afterthought given to a different development team and don't play a huge part in the actual story. Contextually, they're a bit odd sometimes, but usually they're a nice change of pace, all things considered. Even better, I never really got bored of them. Given how I did get bored of them by the end of the previous Zero Escape games, that's a good mark. And it's really hard to talk about the entertainment without delving too much into spoilers, but I enjoyed it thoroughly. There's good mystery, there's good characters, there was an overall good focus on what I want out of the Zero Escape series. And really, that's about as much as I can say. Zero Escape, Zero Time Dilemma is a great send-off to a great series. It can have hiccups aplenty with its presentations, and suffers from some pacing issues during the mid-sections of the game, but it takes another step in refining the escape room puzzles, mixing up the formula enough to keep everything fresh, and clearly knowing its audience in both narrative and the other mechanics of the game. In fact, this game feels like a proper love letter to the audience after its existence was solely spawned from the same fandom's fervor. I'd ultimately say that, despite it being pulled down at some times, despite it not meshing with everyone like any game will, that Zero Time Dilemma is top of the genre. Whatever genre that might be now, it doesn't really matter at this point. If you like this sort of game, then you'll probably like this one. Mind you, it's not a great entry point to the series. It certainly is not a good entry point to the series. It builds heavily off previous games for a large part of the cast's background and the general premise. It also uses quite a few of those previous characters to finish up their character arcs in this story. But at the same time, it's hard for me to mark down too much for that, since the intent is a payoff and not potentially confusing references for the sake of interconnectivity. Barring character backgrounds, character arcs, and the initial motivations, the premise is quite isolated too. I'd ultimately have to suggest playing the previous games before attempting this one or looking too much up about it, but this is certainly one you'll want to get to eventually. Okay, recommendation time. What do I have? First up, Steins Gate. What an appropriate time for me to suggest this. It has an anime, it has a visual novel. Both are extremely good. The visual novel's better, but the anime might be a less of a commitment to jump into. But I'd say both of them are excellent. And why do I suggest it? I'd say it has to do with the whole tension, high stakes, high sort of character-driven aspect of mystery and dread that's combined with that really sort of compelling character and characterization and all that. I'd say it really does have sort of the same feel if you're looking for this sort of visual novel-esque type game. And I'd say it's probably one of the best out there. I'd even say that Steins Gate is, well, better than the Zero Escape series, though the Zero Escape series is probably a bit more full dive in because of just how in-depth the Zero Escape series can get. You also have Sweet Views. I actually reviewed both these games on my channel, so feel free to go check them out. I might have recommended both of these for another game at some point. I don't remember which one because I remember talking about that before, but Sweet Views is sort of the whole death game aspect again, so you actually do have that sort of dreadful tension-based. It's more of a dating sim because there's character-based endings and it's a female protagonist with guy options. So if you're interested in giving that a shot, I'd say it's another one of these sorts of stories within the genre that really do compel and are worth it. I'd also like to note that I'm sorry, this is going up so much later than I want it to, and I've had problems doing so many things lately. I guess I'll see you all next time. Drive safely, everyone.